Story 1. It was an unseasonably warm night, the kind that makes the city hum with an unusual energy. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver light over the apartment complex where 17-year-old Emily lived. She had just finished a late study session at the library and was riding the elevator back to her apartment on the 22nd floor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and a soft hum filled the small space as the elevator ascended. Emily leaned against the wall, her backpack heavy with textbooks and her mind buzzing with equations. She glanced at her phone. 11:47 p.m. Her mother had texted her earlier, reminding her not to stay out too late. Emily smiled, thinking about the warm bed and the comfort of her room waiting for her. Suddenly, the elevator shuddered. The lights flickered violently, then went out, plunging Emily into darkness. The hum of the motor ceased, and the elevator came to an abrupt halt. Panic clawed at her chest as she fumbled for her phone, the only source of light in the pitch-black box. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. She turned on the flashlight app and pointed it around the elevator, illuminating the cramped space. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked as scared as she felt. Emily pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. She tried the buttons for other floors, but the elevator remained stubbornly still. Her breath quickened as she realized she was trapped. She called her mother, but the call wouldn't go through. "No service," she muttered, staring at her phone screen in disbelief. She pounded on the door, yelling for help, but the thick steel muffled her cries. After what felt like an eternity, her voice grew hoarse, and she slid down the wall, hugging her knees to her chest. As the minutes ticked by, the air grew stuffy, and sweat began to bead on her forehead. Emily's mind raced, conjuring images of her being trapped for days. She shook her head, trying to dispel the rising fear. She needed to stay calm and think. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise. She held her breath, straining to listen. It sounded like whispering. She frowned, pressing her ear against the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but she couldn't make out any words. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the sound was coming from within the elevator shaft. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She backed away from the door, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Then, without warning, the elevator jolted. Emily screamed, dropping her phone. The light spun wildly as the phone clattered to the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The elevator seemed to shake with an unnatural force, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. Emily grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. She pointed the light at the control panel, but the buttons were now unlit and unresponsive. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to understand what was happening. This couldn't be real. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the elevator, followed by a scraping noise. It sounded like something, or someone, was climbing up the elevator shaft. Emily's eyes widened in terror. She backed into the corner, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The scraping grew louder, and the elevator shuddered again. Emily's mind raced. She had to find a way out. She glanced up and saw the emergency hatch in the ceiling. Summoning all her courage, she stood on the railing and pushed against the hatch. It was heavy, but it budged. She shoved harder until it finally opened with a creak. Emily pulled herself up through the hatch, her muscles straining with the effort. She was now on top of the elevator, the dark shaft stretching endlessly above and below her. The air was colder here, and the whispers were louder. She looked down and saw faint shapes moving in the darkness below. Panic surged through her, and she began to climb the emergency ladder attached to the wall. Her hands were slick with sweat, and her heart pounded in her ears. She climbed as fast as she could, not daring to look down. The whispers followed her, growing more insistent. She felt something brush against her ankle and nearly lost her grip. Stifling a scream, she forced herself to keep climbing. After what felt like hours, she reached the door to the 23rd floor. She banged on it with all her might, praying that someone would hear her. The whispers were deafening now, and she could feel a cold presence closing in on her. Just when she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, the door opened. A pair of strong hands pulled her through, and she collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. She looked up and saw a maintenance worker, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping her to her feet. Emily nodded, though she felt far from okay. She glanced back at the elevator shaft, but the whispers had ceased, and the dark shapes were gone. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. The maintenance worker shook his head. "I don't know. We've had some issues with the elevators before, but nothing like this." Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. She knew she'd never be able to explain what she had experienced. All she knew was that she never wanted to set foot in that elevator again. The worker escorted her back to her apartment, and Emily thanked him profusely before closing the door behind her. She leaned against the door, taking a deep breath. Her mother was asleep, unaware of the nightmare her daughter had just endured. Emily crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The room was silent, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She closed her eyes, willing herself to forget the horrors of the night. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. "We'll see you again." Emily's eyes snapped open, but there was no one there. The room was empty. She pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew the truth. The elevator had shown her a glimpse of something dark and unexplainable, and she had a feeling it wasn't finished with her yet. Story 2. Lisa Jenkins woke up to the sound of her alarm clock blaring at 7 a.m., as she did every weekday morning. Her life was a well-oiled machine of routines. Wake up, shower, dress, grab a quick breakfast, and head to work. She was an ambitious young woman, fresh out of college and working as a junior graphic designer at a reputable advertising firm in downtown Chicago. She loved her job, despite the long hours and the occasional difficult client. Her drive and passion for creativity made every day at the office an adventure. On this particular Wednesday, Lisa was running slightly behind schedule. She hastily pulled on her favorite blue blouse and black pencil skirt, grabbed her bag, and rushed out of her small studio apartment. She didn't have time for breakfast today, but she'd grab a coffee and a bagel from the cafe near her office. The weather was unseasonably warm for early June, and Lisa appreciated the bright sunshine as she walked briskly to the train station. The city was alive with the hustle and bustle of the morning commute. She liked to people watch during her walk, imagining the stories behind the faces she saw every day. Lisa arrived at her office building with 10 minutes to spare. The modern glass and steel structure stood tall among the older, more traditional buildings in the area. She greeted the security guard with a friendly nod and stepped into the lobby, heading straight for the bank of elevators. The office building had 30 floors, and Lisa's firm occupied the 20th. She pressed the up button and waited, tapping her foot impatiently. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside, joining a few other early risers. The doors closed with a soft ding, and the elevator began its ascent. Lisa checked her phone, scrolling through emails and notifications. She barely noticed the other passengers getting off at various floors. When the elevator reached the 15th floor, she was alone. She leaned against the wall, feeling the slight vibration as the elevator continued its smooth climb. Suddenly, the elevator jerked to a stop. Lisa stumbled, clutching the handrail for support. The lights flickered briefly before steadying again. She looked up, confused and a little alarmed. Elevators in modern buildings rarely malfunctioned, and she'd never experienced anything like this before. Lisa pressed the buttons for the 20th and ground floors, but nothing happened. She tried the emergency call button, but there was no response. Her heart began to race as she realized she was trapped. Taking a deep breath, she tried to remain calm. Surely, someone would notice the elevator was stuck and send help. As the minutes ticked by, her anxiety grew. She banged on the doors and shouted, hoping someone outside would hear her. The confined space seemed to shrink around her, and the air felt thicker. She tried the emergency call button again, but it still didn't work. Then, she heard a faint hissing sound. Lisa looked around, trying to locate the source of the noise. Her eyes widened in horror when she saw a small stream of water trickling from a corner of the elevator. The trickle quickly became a steady flow, and the water began to pool around her feet. The water rose steadily, inch by inch, covering the elevator floor. Lisa's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She banged on the doors again, screaming for help, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the thick metal walls. She tried prying the doors open with her fingers, but they didn't budge. The water was now up to her ankles, cold and relentless. Lisa shivered, more from fear than the temperature. She pulled her phone out, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. She cursed under her breath, the panic in her chest rising as quickly as the water. Minutes felt like hours as the water continued to rise. It was now up to her knees. She could feel her breaths coming in short, frantic gasps. She tried to calm herself, telling herself that someone would notice the malfunction and come to her rescue. As the water reached her waist, Lisa's hope began to wane. She could no longer control her shaking, her teeth chattering from fear and cold. She had always had a fear of drowning, a fear she thought irrational until now. The thought of dying in this small metal box was unbearable. Lisa screamed again, pounding the doors with all her strength. Her voice was hoarse, her fists bruised from the effort. The water was now chest high, and she had to tilt her head back to keep her mouth and nose above the surface. Tears mingled with the cold water, streaming down her face as she sobbed in desperation. The water continued its relentless rise. Lisa's strength was waning, her limbs heavy and numb from the cold. She tried to float, to keep her head above the water, but the confined space made it difficult. She pressed her back against one wall, her feet against the opposite one, trying to keep herself upright. The water reached her chin, and Lisa knew she had only moments left. She took deep, ragged breaths, trying to fill her lungs with as much air as possible. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. She thought of her family, her friends, her unfinished dreams. She wasn't ready to die. As the water reached her nose, Lisa tilted her head back, straining to keep her mouth above the surface. Her breaths came in desperate, shallow gulps. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She was about to give in to the dark, cold water, when suddenly she felt a jolt. The elevator doors burst open, and Lisa was thrown out by the force of the water. She tumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, coughing up water, and shaking uncontrollably. She lay on the floor, drenched and shivering, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. After a few moments, she felt strong hands lifting her to her feet. She looked up to see the concerned faces of her co-workers and building security. They were speaking to her, asking if she was okay, but their voices seemed distant, muffled. Lisa nodded weakly, too exhausted and traumatized to respond. Lisa was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for hypothermia and shock. Her parents rushed to her side, their faces pale with worry. She tried to reassure them, but she was still in a state of disbelief. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive. If the elevator doors hadn't opened when they did, she would have drowned. Over the next few days, Lisa struggled to come to terms with her experience. The memories haunted her, invading her dreams and causing her to wake up in a cold sweat. She couldn't bring herself to enter another elevator. The thought of being trapped again was unbearable. With the support of her family and friends, Lisa slowly began to heal. She started seeing a therapist who helped her work through her trauma. She returned to work after a few weeks, but she took the stairs instead of the elevator. Her co-workers were understanding, giving her the space she needed to adjust. Lisa's experience changed her. She became more appreciative of the little things in life, more aware of the fragility of existence. She realized how easily everything could be taken away and decided to live her life to the fullest. She took up new hobbies, traveled to new places, and reconnected with old friends. The memory of the elevator still lingered, a dark shadow in the back of her mind, but she refused to let it control her. She had faced her worst fear and survived. She was stronger than she had ever imagined. Months passed, and Lisa found herself standing in front of the elevator once again. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms sweaty. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was safe, that the malfunction had been a rare and freak occurrence. With a determined look, she pressed the up button. The doors slid open, revealing the empty elevator car. She stepped inside, her heart racing. The doors closed, and she felt a moment of panic, but she pushed it down, focusing on her breathing. The elevator began its ascent, and Lisa closed her eyes, counting the seconds. When the doors opened on the 20th floor, she let out a sigh of relief. She had done it. She had faced her fear and won. Lisa stepped out of the elevator, her head held high. She was no longer the same person who had been trapped and nearly drowned. She was stronger, braver, and ready to take on whatever life threw at her next.